this is an event that had initially been scheduled for last spring, and we're really happy to be able to bring it to you this evening. My name is Matthew Engelke. I'm the director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life here at Columbia, and it's my pleasure to introduce Frank Guridy, who is the chair this evening, and I will get on to doing so in just a minute. But before that, let me just offer a few pieces of housekeeping. The event tonight is being recorded and will be on our website probably next week. So if you have friends and colleagues who were unable to attend this evening, please do direct them to the video so that this can be shared far and wide. We are operating tonight under the Zoom format of a webinar, which means that if and when you have questions for the panelists this evening, please do feel free to type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should see the little Q&A box. You can type in your questions there. You can do so anonymously, or you can identify yourself if you wish. And you can do that at any point during the proceedings. So if questions occur to you during one of the speakers' presentations, you're welcome to type it in then. You're also welcome to wait until the discussion at the end. And the way we will structure this evening is each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes on the themes of gestures of protest and piety. And then Frank Guridy, our chair, will convene or moderate a discussion, pose a few questions to them, and maybe offer a few comments on the basis of his own considerable expertise and interest in these issues. And then we will be able to turn over to you all for the Q&A. We're really looking forward to this. And let me now move on to introducing Frank Guridy, who is an associate professor of history and African American and African diaspora studies here at Columbia University. Frank is the author of 3 books, most recently The Sports Revolution, How Texas Changed the Culture of American Athletics, and that was just published earlier this year by the University of Texas Press. And he's currently working on a book looking at the history of stadiums, primarily in the United States, although he tells me that scope might shift, but looking at the history of stadiums in American life, not only in relation to sports, but as central sites for the history and understanding of social justice movements, urban life, and the infrastructures of the city. I had the pleasure of speaking with him earlier today about this project, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it come to fruition. I'm also really grateful to Frank for helping conceptualize this evening's event. He was really instrumental in putting this together, and it's one of the real pleasures of directing IRCPL to work with colleagues across the university who have both shared and divergent interests to collaborate in this way. And I'm incredibly grateful to our guests as well for joining us, and to the staff at IRCPL for work behind the scenes, especially Mariana Pecoraro, our program and communications manager, who has put together this webinar. So let me now turn over to Professor Guridy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Matthew, for that introduction. And I want to thank you for actually really generating the idea of this panel, a conversation we had, I guess it was a year ago, to try to figure out how do we create a conversation that merges sport and social justice, sport and politics, with religion and justice and politics. And that's what we're going to do here this evening. So I really appreciate you reaching out to me and us having that conversation that started a year ago. And I also want to thank Mariana for shepherding us through these different transitions that we've been undergoing during our endless COVID period of history here. There's been a lot written about religion and politics. That's an understatement for sure. Whether we're talking about the religious right in the United States, or if we're talking about Islamic fundamentalism, right, that tried and true subject that always grips the Western media, as it did yet again this past summer when the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. And there's certainly been a whole lot of written and discussed about sport and politics, particularly the resurgence of athlete activism that we've seen over the last 8 years since the murders of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. And going back further, of course, to the iconic protests of Tommie Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City. But we think, or I think, and I think Matthew and I think, it's rare that these conversations merge together, right? This panel is an attempt to bring these seemingly discrete topics, right? Religion over here, religion and politics, sport and politics on this side, into what we think will be a generative conversation about the intersection of race, politics, sport, and faith. One of those intersections between these separate spheres is the power of the gesture, the power of the body as a signal of commitment to faith, to justice, or as a call to action. What work do gestures do in public culture? How does the body signal convictions and commitment? Such questions have been especially important in recent years when it comes to the intersections of racial justice, social protests, and sports. By taking a knee, right, the boundaries between the religious, the political, and the social forms of action are purposely blurred. And in this event, right, we seek to bring together leading experts on sport, race, and religion, and the body to discuss the intersections of protest and piety in contemporary and historical perspective. Okay, I have the honor of introducing our three distinguished panelists. I will put their longer bios in the chat, but I do want to introduce them here. And I'll start with Randall Balmer, who is John Phillips Professor in Religion at Dartmouth College. Before arriving to Dartmouth, he taught here at Columbia Barnard and has held a number of distinguished appointments at a variety of institutions. He's the author of more than a dozen books, including God in the White House, How Faith Shaped the Presidency from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush, The Making of Evangelicalism, From Revivalism to Politics and Beyond, Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture in America, which was adopted into an award-winning documentary from PBS. And most recently, I'm very eager to read this book. It just came out, I guess, in August, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. Professor Balmer, we're happy to have you here tonight. What I'm going to do is just introduce all three speakers, and then I'll just turn it over to our first speaker, Professor Balmer. Okay, that's Professor Balmer. Our second panelist is Ben Carrington, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Journalism at the University of Southern California, USC. Ben is widely regarded as one of the world's leading authorities on the sociology of sport, sociology of race, politics, and popular culture. Prior to joining USC, Professor Carrington taught in the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas, Austin. We were colleagues there for 11, 12 years. He was there for 13 years. And before that, he worked at the University of Brighton in England. He's published numerous articles and essays on these topics, and he's published 4 books, including the critically acclaimed Race, Sport, and Politics, The Sporting Black Diaspora, published in 2010. In addition to his scholarly publications, Professor Carrington is a public sociologist who has authored op-eds for publications such as The Guardian, The HuffPost, and he regularly appears in news media as a commentator on race, culture, and politics, and has written and presented a documentary on the life and legacy of Stuart Hall for public radio in the United States. Last but certainly not least is Professor Samantha Sheppard, who's Associate Professor of Cinema and Media Studies in the Department of Performing and Media Arts at Cornell University. Dr. Sheppard's research interests include Black cultural production, African-American representation in cinema, television studies, sports films, feminist media studies, embodiment studies, and critical race theory. She writes extensively on issues of race, gender, and representation in film, television, and digital media. She's the author of the outstanding book, Sporting Blackness, Race, Embodiment, and Critical Muscle Memory on Screen, published by the University of California Press in 2020. She's the co-editor of anthologies, including From Medea to Media Mogul, Theorizing Tyler Perry, Sporting Realities, Critical Readings on the Sports Documentary with Travis Vogan as well. She's published a number of essays in feminist media histories, Film Quarterly, The Velvet Light Trap, Cinema Journal, the Journal of Sports History, and among other periodicals and anthologies. She's written, of course, also for the Atlantic, Flash, Art International, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Just to reiterate, the format will be as follows. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes. I will keep time gently using the chat function, and I'll just give you just sort of warnings, like 2-minute warnings, etc. So 10 minutes each for each panelist. Then I will lead a group discussion among us, the panelists, for about 20 minutes, and then we'll move into the question and answer session. And as has already been pointed out, please enter your questions using the Q&A function on the webinar. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to Professor Balmer.
Thank you, Frank, and I'm delighted to be here with such distinguished panelists, and it's good to meet all of you, as well as those who are tuning in to this webinar, I guess is the term these days. I'm going to talk a little bit about a book that I just sent off to the publisher, which should be out in September next year, called, my title at least, is To Everything a Season, Religion, Race, and Team Sports in North America. And the book really has two different inspirations. So one is my graduate school years, which now are quite a few decades in the past. And my mentor in the history department at Princeton was a man named John Murren, who sadly passed away last year from COVID. But John was a wonderful, extraordinary colonial historian, but also somebody very interested in sports. He used to talk about sports in various ways. And I've actually been thinking about his ideas for probably 40 years now, and decided finally to put them all down. I would have gladly deferred to John and let him do it for himself, but he never got around to it. And so this is my offering. And as you might imagine, the book is dedicated to him. It's really an extraordinary mentor and a very important figure in my life. The second inspiration for this book was my discovery of sports radio in the early 1990s when I was teaching at Columbia. And at first I was dumbfounded by this. I couldn't understand how it was that a radio host and a whole phalanx of callers could sustain a 4-hour conversation over whether or not Joe Torre should have lifted the pitcher at the bottom of the 6th inning. And I became intrigued by this, and frankly addicted to sports radio, and began to try to understand this and understand the peculiar passion that particularly white males have invested into the world of sports. And so this book, To Everything a Season, is trying to understand that. So in this book, I'm going to just quickly give a quick summary of it. I look at the 4 main team sports in North America, which I understand to be baseball, football, hockey, and basketball, and talk about the peculiar characteristics of each one, how each one of them emerged from particular historical circumstances. For example, baseball was really developed during the Industrial Revolution, and yet it rejects the icon of industrialism, which is the clock. It is the only team sport, major team sport at least, that does not rule itself by time or by the clock. And even the base runner circling the bases does so counterclockwise, as though he's trying to subvert the passage of time. It's also an immigrant game. It's the only game where the defense controls the ball, and the object of the offensive player is to disrupt the defense's control of the ball, or the world more broadly. There are 3 islands of safety out in that hostile territory, and of course the greatest triumph is to return home, which of course is the immigrant ideal as well, to return home triumphantly. Football was a military game, is a military game, concerned with the conquest and the defense of territory, developed by the sons, nephews, brothers of Union Army officers during the Civil War. And I've gone into a lot of the rhetoric surrounding football, and militarism is just replete within football. Hockey is Canada's game. It was really developed out of lacrosse, of course, it evolved from lacrosse. And in 1867, the same year as the Canadian Confederation, a dentist in Montreal by the name of George Beers issued a statement calling on Canadians to adopt their own game Unlike cricket, a game that would reflect Canadian values and the Canadian frontier. And that, of course, was lacrosse, which became routinized and eventually evolved into hockey. And then finally, basketball, which is the quintessential urban game developed by a YMCA instructor at what is now Springfield College in Massachusetts. And the idea is to maneuver in a very constricted space without impeding the progress of others, which is something that is the task of the urban dweller. Anybody who has tried to navigate Times Square in the evening or Fifth Avenue at lunch hour knows exactly the skills needed to succeed on the basketball court. So that's the one dimension of it. And the other dimension is, as I said, trying to understand why it is that white males find sports so intriguing. And I think it has to do with a kind of alternative universe that is created by the world of sports, that for white males is very much in contrast to their perceptions of the larger world. This is a world that is the world of sports that is not burdened by a preferential treatment. Now, again, this is the perception on the part of these sports fans rather than the reality, but they perceive the larger world as disordered and unfair. And whereas the world of sports is precise, with the geometricality of even the sports fields being part of the appeal to this, for this demographic. So I'm going to read, if you don't mind, just a portion from the conclusion of this book, talking about the appeal and the paradoxes behind the appeal of sports to white sports fans. Even so, the real world has a way of intruding into the realm of sport. Issues of race and gender, and more recently, transgender identity, provoke comment, reflection, and reaction. Economics and economic inequality always loom. Patriotism and the peculiar custom of singing national anthems before sporting events, and not, say, at rock concerts or museum openings or a motion picture premiere, go unquestioned until the custom is challenged or its meaning reconfigured. Anyone determined to make such a challenge, however, Mahmoud Abdul Rauf or Colin Kaepernick, of course, come to mind, faces the obloquy of teammates, fans, and owners, and even the end of one's professional career. The world of sports, like the world of religion, is not without controversy. But despite these intrusions, the lure of an alternative universe for many remains strong, even irresistible, affording both escape and a sense of community. Anticipating his return to the ballpark after a season of exclusion because of the coronavirus, a Nationals fan told the Washington Post, "It's entering a different world of familiar pleasures, rituals, excitement, companionship, with an outcome." For an older generation of American males, military service in World War II or the Korean War provided the venue for bonding with other men. Strong ties of friendship and camaraderie were forged in bunkers, in air squadrons, or on board a destroyer. Many in the succeeding generation sought to avoid the draft, so they have no regiment reunions to show for their friendships. They do not gather in VFW halls to swap war stories and renew ties with their combat buddies. The stories of subsequent generations are stories of athletic prowess, the improbable touchdown pass, the hat trick or the no-hitter, Steph Curry's magnificent arc from mid-court, Matthew Stafford's latest fourth quarter comeback. The interest in sports and sports memorabilia almost certainly connotes a nostalgia for the simpler days of childhood, but it also provides a common vocabulary for male interaction and bonding. This is the language of the disaffected male and the foundation of a powerful new impulse, one that inspires uncommon devotion. Any relationship has its share of paradoxes, and the almost symbiotic connection between white males and team sports is no exception. First, there are economic anomalies. the struggling blue-collar worker cheering for players who make more in a single season than the worker might earn in the course of his lifetime. Second, the paradox of white fans watching and appreciating the athleticism of players, many of whom are not white. This could be innocent and race blind, but it also could reflect a systemic and race-based assumption that the appropriate arena of self-expression for Black people and other people of color is, well, the arena, and not so much the world outside of the stadium. This sort of racism, though it may not be acknowledged as such by white fans, might explain the white backlash against Kaepernick and other players who kneeled during the national anthem. So long as they're considered mascots or gladiators competing within the confines of the game itself, they are worthy of respect, even adulation. But once they dare to express themselves on matters beyond sports, they are vilified and ostracized. In a narrow sense, that response might be expected, even understandable. Having fled the real world into the parallel universe of clear expectations and tidy boundaries, white fans are loath to be reminded of what they seek to ignore. And so they punish athletes of color who dare to erase an idealized separation between sports and politics. In 1961, after Bill Russell, star of the Boston Celtics, led a walkout of Black players from an NBA game in Lexington, Kentucky, to protest racial discrimination, he said, "I am coming to the realization that we are accepted as entertainers, but that we are not accepted as people in some places." Perhaps no one better illustrates this racial double standard than Laura Ingram, Fox television personality. When Drew Brees, quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, who was white, declared that he will never agree with NFL players who kneeled during the national anthem, Ingram said, "He's allowed to have his view," adding, "He's a person. He has some worth." Earlier, however, when Black NBA players LeBron James and Kevin Durant expressed support for the Black Lives Matter movement, Ingram instructed them to, quote, "keep the political commentary to yourself," and "shut up and dribble." This bifurcation manifests itself on both sides of the political spectrum. Boston Red Sox fans hailed Curt Schilling's heroic efforts to bring the city a championship in 2004, ending an 86-year drought. But Schilling's hard right sympathies, comparing Muslims to Nazis, suggesting that journalists should be lynched or that Hillary Clinton, quote, "should be buried under a jail somewhere," belittling transgender rights, cost him an analyst position with ESPN and, very likely, election to the Hall of Fame. This treating of athletes differently on and off the field may be nothing new. Whereas ancient Greeks valorized athletes and actors, Rome regarded them as negligible, even dishonorable. Tertullian, the early church father who lived at the turn of the 3rd century, commented on contemporary spectacles and what he characterized as the perversity of popular attitudes toward the players. The characters and actors of these spectacles, the charioteers, stage heroes, boxers, and gladiators of which people are so fond, to whom men submit their souls and women even submit their bodies, he wrote, are at the same time both despised and exalted. They are even condemned to infamy and denied the rights of citizens. The racial divide in contemporary sports, however, cannot be ignored in accounting for the chasm between adulation and opprobrium. The specter of white male fans cheering for athletes of color in the arena may be nothing more than that. Spectators appreciating the beauty of the game, physical prowess, and the thrill of competition. But another nefarious interpretation cannot be dismissed altogether, and it may even coexist with that benign view. It is suggested to me by the harrowing scene in the opening chapter of Ralph Ellison's novel Invisible Man, where Black teenagers, blindfolded, were herded into a boxing ring to pummel one another for the amusement of tuxedoed male spectators in a smoke-filled ballroom. Then, exhausted, glistening with sweat, and on hands and knees, they were forced to collect their compensation, coins and worthless black brass tokens, interspersed with a few crumpled dollar bills from an electrified carpet, once again, for the merriment of the crowd. Parallels with the contemporary world of sports, thankfully, are not exact, but I'm struck by white men posing as something akin to overlords of the athletic arena. How many professional team owners are not white? But this may apply to fandom as well. In this alternate universe of sports, athletes, especially athletes of color, are expected to stay in their lane and forbear speaking out on matters other than sports, as Bill Russell attested and Colin Kaepernick learned. And to add a gender component to this analysis, where are women in this hyper-masculinized universe? If they appear at all, they typically are relegated literally to the sidelines as cheerleaders or ball girls. I can't claim any experience or much knowledge of fantasy sports, but it appears that allowing fans to pose as general managers and assemble fantasy teams carries with it the corollary of viewing athletes as commodities, a form of chattel expected to perform, not opine. Shut up and dribble. Thank you.
Thank you, Randall. Looking forward to talking about some of the things you've said here. I'd like to pass it over to Professor Carrington.
Good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on what time zone you're in. Thank you for the organisers for putting on today's event. And because we've been given about 10 minutes to speak, and I want to make sure that that I stick to time, I'll just jump straight into the talk. So what work do gestures do in public culture? How does the body signal convictions and commitment? In thinking about those two provocative framing questions for today's discussion, especially in the context of sports, I've been moved to consider the particular political moment in which we find ourselves, a moment in which the political right, as well as their fellow travelers who claim monikers such as moderate centrists and rational liberals, have increasingly tried to relabel the convictions, demands, and commitments of various social movements as, quote, mere gesture politics. We are by now familiar with the charge and the language used by the right and the self-defined centrist liberals, naming the various and varied political interventions by leftist social movements as, quote, virtual signaling. Now, leaving aside for the moment the merits or otherwise of contemporary political interventions of the left, there is an assumption behind some of these debates that is worth unpacking. One response from those accused of such shallow politics is to deny that their political stands are just gestural or merely symbolic, and instead to point to the more substantive aspects of their political commitments. I understand this move, but I think that it at best elides an important discussion about symbols, and at worst reinforces a certain problematic logic about the role of gestures within politics, and therefore the importance of symbolism, meaning making, and representation as a necessary aspect of human life. What if, rather than trying to disassociate ourselves from the charge that certain political gestures are, quote, just symbolic, that we instead reclaimed the importance of symbolism and questioned the very idea that to be virtuous and wanting to demonstrate that is necessarily a bad thing. What kind of politics do we have in being virtuous, concerned with the well-being of our fellow human beings, and indeed of extending our circle of compassion to include the environment and the rest of the varied species on Earth is considered to be a bad thing? Symbols, in fact, matter. The work of gestures is not a retreat from politics, from engagement, from reshaping the material conditions of existence, but is in fact a necessary and vital form of action. As we readily know from religion, the notion that symbols do not do any work, are somehow passive, inert, and inactive is fundamentally misplaced, as both anthropologists and semiologists have reminded us for decades now. The work of representation, to paraphrase Stuart Hall, is vitally important as a form of meaning making, a mode of communication and understanding, and as the very process by which we come to understand the world, our place within it, and potentially, therefore, our ability to reshape that world. Now, it is certainly true that there is no inherent meaning within things, within symbols. That is to say, any particular gesture comes to have meaning only when it is situated within a longer signifying chain, and when it becomes culturally embedded within a specific society at a specific moment in time. Thus, to return to the question, what work do gestures do in public life and in public culture? The only answer surely is, it depends. If this seems unsatisfactory, it is because we have either put too much or too little weight upon the work of gestures, the work of symbolism, and the work of representation. It both matters vitally and at the same time has no inherent meaning other than the political work to which the gesture is put. As both Professors Engelke and Balmer could no doubt better explain than me, to take a knee certainly has religious connotations, but these meanings vary greatly depending on the religion in question and even the different historical periods for the same religion. Thus, kneeling can come to mean and to signify to be subservient, to offer deference and respect toward nobility, to submit to some higher authority, to show your helplessness in the presence of God, of whom you ask forgiveness. And it can sometimes invoke a sense of mourning, sadness, or loss. Or it can signify a radical refusal, a righteous anger and hope, and even some of these things at the very same time. There is something to be considered here about the specificity of sport, about which I've not said much yet. So let me just center the question of sport. If Norbert Elias was right in observing many years ago that part of sport's enduring appeal is the quest for excitement and pleasure in the context of our increasingly emotionally constrained and socially sanitized lives, then sports taps into something that is quite fundamentally expressive of the human condition. That is the contradictory and paradoxical character of sport. It is a form of structured freedom, a form of play delimited by constraints, but that nonetheless has within its ludic structure the potential for forms of creativity and beauty that locate it as an important site for human expression. Johann Huizinga is very useful here when he suggests that the first characteristic of play is not just that it is freely chosen, but that play is freedom. Whilst Huizinga pessimistically believed that the play spirit had been virtually extinguished from modern sport due to the processes and forces of bureaucratization and professionalization, the play element clearly maintains a residual presence even within the hyper-commercialized spaces of elite sports cultures that eschew political expression, let alone dissent. In this context, we might need to more centrally locate race, and more specifically to locate the conjunctural meeting of white colonial logics that placed the black body outside the category of the human, alongside the emergence of modern sport as an institution and an episteme that construct an idealized representation of the human body? What cultural activity, after all, centers the body and therefore the human body, and therefore the myths of race more than sport? It is, as Stuart Hall once noted, quote, the culture of sport where the nation's myths and meanings are fabricated. Another way to think about this issue is to view sport itself as an embodied form of politics. That is to consider how the very act or performance of athleticism can be read as a form of claim making on the world, that within bodily movement, there is always a deeply aesthetic and therefore political dimension at play, which is given wider racial significance in societies whose structures are deeply racialized. Consider the section from La Dame de la Terre, when Frantz Fanon, trying to make sense of liberation and freedom in a context of colonialism and what resistance against the colonial world should look like, states the following. Fanon says, the first thing the colonial subject learns is to remain in his place and not overstep its limits. Hence, the dreams of the colonial subject are muscular dreams, dreams of action, dreams of aggressive vitality. I dream I am jumping, swimming, running, and climbing. I dream I burst out laughing. I'm leaping across a river and chased by a pack of cars that never catches up with me. During colonization, the colonized subject frees himself night after night between 9 in the evening and 6 in the morning. Now, Fanon's provocative insight that subaltern freedom and emancipation from the colonial world are embedded within a kind of physicality, or at least within the dreamlike fantasies of physicality, is a useful starting point from which to better appreciate why sport has often been an important and at times almost a metaphysical side of self-actualization for those Black subjects post-slavery freedoms and claims to citizenship, which were curtailed by white supremacy, whether that was in the US under Jim Crow laws, under Western colonial governance in Africa, the Americas and the Caribbean, or later in post-colonial Europe and the so-called former settler colonies. Sport, as a structured pursuit of useless play, simultaneously serves to dramatize and accentuate the very conditions of racial subordination and freedom from constraint that the colonial world and anti-Black racism inscribes onto Black bodies. Both negation and emancipation are found in the autotelic pleasures of creativity and movement that sport produces for the racialized subaltern. The colonial subjects' ludic-like dreams of muscular prowess, as Fanon puts it, imbue the category of sport with a form of physical release and symbolic power that resonates far beyond the playing fields. In this context, we might suggest that sports becomes co-articulated with discourses of freedom and hope in the reconfiguring of the category of the human as homo ludens, simultaneously announcing Black athleticism as a claim to and critique of Western modernity itself. To conclude, as authors like Claudia Rankine in her work Citizen and her powerful analysis of the media discourses surrounding Serena Williams, or Kevin Quashie in his work The Sovereignty of Quiet Beyond Resistance in Black Cultures, or as Professor Sheppard in her brilliant book Sporting Blackness and her concept of critical muscle memories have shown us, the bold gestures of subsequent Black athletes and their physical victories, the refusal to be disciplined by white norms, and the resistant acts to refuse to play sports with a deferential bow, and instead to stand boldly or to kneel silently in protest. All these moments need to be understood as bodily expressions of a Black politics of liberation that are as significant as any formal textual declarations of freedom. In her book, The Hawthorne Archives, Letters from the Utopian Margins, Avery Goulden notes, quote, freedom is the process by which you develop a practice for being unavailable for servitude. Extending Foucault's ideas concerning the practices of freedom, Maggie Nelson similarly reminds us of the fact that freedom and unfreedom are always enmeshed, that interdependence and entanglement is a fate for our collective humanity, whether we like it or not. So I wonder then, if what disturbs so many about athletes, quote, taking a knee, is not so much or only the disruption of sport's supposed sacred playing fields by the gesture politics of the virtual signaling left, but rather that the gesture is a powerful symbolic reminder of both white supremacy's ongoing project to deny Black humanity and the radical Black freedom movements that refuse to accept that condition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those set of remarks, Ben. Now I'd like to pass it over to Professor Sheppard.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I want to say thank you all for being here, and I will get started very shortly. I don't think that worked. Maybe it did. Here we go. All right, just to not make a new slide, not give a whole new PowerPoint to you right now, not try to do that, just play from the beginning. Okay, so I want to talk about a few things for my 10 minutes, which are going to already fly by, but let's just begin. So basically, yesterday, Ebony dropped the new cover, its new November cover, and on the cover is Colin Kaepernick, looking like the racially ambiguous Jesus that we all know to possibly exist. And I point this out because in the provocation that is a part of this panel is the notion that by taking a knee, the boundaries between religious, political, and social forms of action are purposely blurred. And I want to draw attention to the ways in which they also become highly symbolic within larger regimes of representation, like Ben has already pointed out, but also within a larger visual and political economy. And so, number one, we often focus on Kaepernick, who, after taking this knee, reshaping the sacred space that is the football arena, the perceived sacred space of the football arena. He reifies in Foucault's terms how the body is directly involved in a political field, and power relations have an immediate hold on them. And therefore his resistant posture operates as a counter signal, an embodied sign that refuses to admit as it was trained for and once was handsomely paid. And so in this gesture, he becomes both meditative and provocative. Now, this concept of being meditative and provocative then shoots out to the ways in which he himself has become this visual signifier of the gesture of protest. Since being blackballed from the league, Kaepernick has signed deals with Disney, Netflix, Audible, Medium, has launched Kaepernick Publishing, and with Ava DuVernay, will soon release his television series, Colin, in black and white. These hierographic treatments also show the ways in which taking a knee or gestures of protest themselves become sacred, but also become visual iconography that reify the idea of men, particularly Black men, as being the sole inheritors of a history of racial justice, social protest, and sports. I'd like us to please shift the conversation. One of the things that was said recently was to ask the question of gender. We have currently and always been asking the question of gender. The gender has often always been masculine. Who you see on screen here is in this corner with the wonderful stare is Gwen Berry. Down here we have Raven Saunders, we have Simone Biles, we have women of the WNBA, and we have Naomi Osaka. I want to get to this question of how we can think about sports, race, and religion and the intersection of protest and piety by pointing out something that Ndizake Shange says in her choreo poem for colored girls who considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. As she ends the piece, she says, "I found God in myself, and I loved her. I loved her fiercely." Jamaican-American writer Michelle Cliff, in her article of the same title, writes that Shange's statement is, quote, an affirmation of the divinity of Black women of all life. She continues by saying, do her words startle or thrill? Because a Black woman recognizes herself as divine, claims God lives in herself, rather than observing the divine as something out there, which will grant favors or prayers or redemption according to its own will, as a result of righteous, by whose definition, behavior or passive acceptance of one's fate. If a Black woman is able to recognize God in herself, by herself, and is able to love this God, then she can love herself also. She will love herself, believe in her worth, hold on to her dignity, no matter how many forces are on the outside are causing her to consider suicide, the death of the body, but also the death of herself, her spirit, her voice. So I want to just add a couple of provocations to my own thoughts about thinking through the idea of I found God in myself and I loved her. I loved her fiercely, to think about how gesture in moments of protest, and particularly women's sports, are coded, and how they are also seen by the athletes themselves. For Gwen Berry, who at the US Olympic trials, Gwen Berry is a hammer thrower. When she was on the podium, while the Star Spangled Banner played, she continually turned around over and over again while holding up a t-shirt that read "activist athlete" draped over her head. On Twitter later, she posted a picture of herself with a caption that said, "Stop playing with me." Up next, we have Raven Saunders, who was a US shot putter, who, when she won the silver medal at the Olympics in Tokyo, held her hands above her head in the shape of an X after accepting the medal. According to her, she said the X represented, quote, "the intersection of where all people who are oppressed meet." As you can see in the images from the WNBA, we have a team who's wearing a shirt that on the front says Jacob Blake, and on the back has the number of bullet holes from when he was shot by police. What you also have in the screen is Simone Biles, who is on the sidelines, who is cheering on her teammates after withdrawing from competition during the Tokyo Olympics. And of course, at the US Open, you have Naomi Osaka, who used each match to wear a different mask with a slain Black person name on the front, including George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, and others. So I bring up these women to say the ways in which we think about gesture, the ways in which we think about protest, and the way we think about sort of embodied resistance, doesn't often think about sort of the histories of Black women's bodies as being caught up and also erased from these narratives of protest, whether it be from their sardonic stares or their physical use of their hands, or their choosing to kneel or take to the sidelines or be silent. There's a larger history around Black women's participation in social justice movements, particularly the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Black women who were instrumental to the civil rights movement, instrumental to racial justice, who have been excised from popular narratives about resistance. And so I begin with Colin Kaepernick, whose actions make us take note of thinking about this contemporary movement with political gesture, with social gesture, and with sport. And he who has been given this deified treatment, even if he had been martyred, like a certain other religious figure I've heard of. But we have not thought about the Berries and the Saunders and the Biles and the Osakas in similar manner. I want to just conclude, because there's really no need to go longer than that, by saying that one of the ways I would like us to reflect on Black bodies' visual and racial excess is to think about our representational forms and functions and systems of sports in various ways, particularly to think about how the Black woman's body is slippery and shifts in and out of view as we try to grapple with the materiality as well as the abstractedness and the psychic manifestations of what protest can mean in gendered and historical context. We can reference and situate the Black female sporting body in time and space as a physical and corporal being who has had to bear witness, who has had to create communion, who has had to resist and stand alone and stand apart and also stand for on stages and on screens, in and out of view, in ways that distinctly differ from many of the Black male and men of color acts of radical non-compliance and resistance in sports today. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sheppard. Oh, there goes my timer. You were so good that I didn't need my timer. So I've got the Herculean task of trying to pull these extraordinarily rich presentations, all delivered in a timely fashion into a conversation that will, of course, spill over into our question and answer period. So just to remind the audience members, we're going to talk here just for a little bit, the four of us, and then we'll get to your questions, but you're welcome to put your questions into the Q&A chat whenever you're ready. I was really struck by the three of your interventions insofar as thinking about the sport and race, starting with Randall and the historic role it has had for white male fans, and it still does in contemporary America, with the ways in which the Black sporting culture, Black sporting performing body has been signified in other ways by Samantha and by Ben, right? And so one question underneath this, which lingers in all three of the papers, and I want to just ask it straight out from the beginning, is to consider, if the three of you could consider what capitalism has to do with all this and what commodification has to do with all this, right? So Ben, for example, you were talking about, this is the ways in which sport, the kind of notion of sport or as play, right, or operating even within hyper commodified, professionalized and collegiate and other even amateur sporting cultures. I was thinking about this, Randall, when you were talking about your immersion in that 20th century sport medium, talk radio, which is still around, right? But I associate that with the last century in some ways. The ways in which the kind of commodification of that kind of sport commentary, which always has grievance, a white grievance underneath it, as you were alluding to in your presentation, is also shaped by the commodifying force of the sport media. And then, of course, I haven't seen that Ebony cover yet, Samantha, in thinking about Colin Kaepernick's journey as a sporting icon, as a commodified subject himself, right? So I was wondering, just a basic question before I get to more specific ones about where do you see commodification and capitalism entering into your analysis here? We can start with Randall, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's there. I don't think there's any question about that. Certainly with sports radio, and I'm kind of distressed to hear that I'm so far behind the times that it's.
No. I listen to sport radio too, but I think about that as
I think you're right.
1990s, 80s, 90s sort of phenomenon.
I think you're right. Well, and the risk that the athletes take in trying to subvert this sort of. Or to puncture this white illusion, I suppose, is that, as I said, they lose their livelihoods. I mean, Colin Kaepernick is a wonderful example. You all you have to do is look at NFL rosters over the last several years and look at the second string quarterbacks. And I mean, how can you not put Colin Kaepernick ahead of pretty much all of them, it seems to me. So he paid a great sacrifice because of this commodification, I should think. Yes.
Should I go next, Frank?
Yeah, sure. Go. Yep.
Okay. Thank you for that question, and it was great to hear my colleagues' talks. They were really provocative and productive, and so thank you for that. Yes, so clearly part of the commodification of the Black athlete is is in part a process of capitalistic extraction of both the kind of the visual representation of the Black athletes, but also the actual bodies, the actual human beings. And I think, the work of Hank Willis Thomas, I think, is really gets to this really well. For those who aren't familiar with Hank Willis Thomas, I strongly encourage you to check out his work. He really gets to some of the core questions which we could frame in kind of Marxist language around dehumanization and alienation, the kind of alienation from athletes' own bodies, which I think is germane to all of the athletes, but has a specific kind of racial logic for Black athletes in particular. And I think part of what's interesting about sports in this moment is both the kind of hyper alienating processes by which athletes come to view their bodies as machines and are encouraged to view their bodies as machines. So this isn't just, the becoming a cog in the wheel of the alienating process of labor accumulation and labor extraction, but to actually see yourself as a machine, as part of the machine. Think of how many Gatorade adverts talk about fueling the body. You're topping up like you would go to the gas station and top up with some 95 octane or whatever it is, fuel. And that's encouraged from a very young age. So this isn't just elite athletes from a young age, from schools, high schools, into colleges. And I think what's interesting about this moment in particular is that part of the coming into consciousness that we see, where, to paraphrase Muhammad Ali's powerful retort, I don't have to be what you want me to be. I do not have to be what you want me to be. I think that this current moment in the kind of coming into consciousness of athletes, Black athletes in particular, but more generally, is the realization that they are, and even, so they don't articulate it in explicitly Marxist language. I don't want to be misunderstood to say that, Naomi Osaka's reading Capital Volume 1 and realizes that the very conditions of her existence are not ones that she made herself and she wants to reclaim it. But there's something about the coming into consciousness, for one thing, athletes recognizing the power that they have, in some cases recognizing that that power is partly derived when they work together collectively as opposed to individually, which is a big part of sports discourse, and that tentatively they want to change and to challenge the conditions under which they play sports. So why do we have to have a press conference right after I've been defeated? Can we just think that through? I signed up to become a professional athlete, and I was told that all the other things I had to sign up for. But I'm thinking about my well-being, my body, my complex humanity, and I want to avoid viewing my own body as simply a machine that goes out there to produce certain types of results. And I think that's a deeply critical moment in which athletes are coming to recognize something about the hyper-commercialized logic of contemporary uber sport, as my friend David Andrews would refer to it as. So I think this is being played out right now. And partly, I think, there's also, to come back to Professor Balmer's point around trying to think through some of the anger towards Colin Kaepernick and others like him, and I like the attempt by Professor Sheppard to kind of both locate Colin Kaepernick, but not to center analysis around him in such a way, but we kind of have to kind of work through him. I think that Kaepernick it's fascinating to me how many people said he's on his job. Like, I don't mind him protesting, but he's at work, as if somehow to be at work would be to negate the possibility that you could articulate a politics anyway. So that acceptance of a capitalistic logic of what work pertains and the freedoms that we give up. And also, it was, as people pointed out, like it wasn't like Cap was taking a knee after the snap in the second down. Like he was quite clearly not taking a knee, quote, at work. Like that would have been interesting to have taken a knee as the snap comes out. He was doing it before the game even started, but there was this kind of expansion. So part of it actually, I think, is a contestation over what constitutes work, what constitutes labor, and extent to which we can exercise a form of control over our labor that includes the articulation of a politics of freedom that capitalism often likes to kind of close down. So I've got some more thoughts, but I'll leave it there.
I figured you would. Yeah. So Professor Sheppard, Ben was anticipating something that's going to, leads directly to your examples, particularly of Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles, around rejecting the kind of the conditions of and the expectation of what athletes are supposed to be doing, including the press conference, and including competing, which I want to come back to that. I don't know if you're going to go there now, but it just triggered a thought as he was speaking. But I wanted to turn over to you.
That was fantastic, and it's perfect in part because I think there's something, the larger question of capital, the larger question of power, and who feels empowered and who feels like their utility is framed through the work shifts. And we saw that with the WNBA when it came to trying to have the Atlanta Dream sell the team, right? There was this sort of collective bargaining on this public scale of vote Warnock and the very sort of real ways in which they saw themselves as working as a unit. Right. And I will also shout out to the WNBA, which is like 100% vaccinated. What do you call it? We are working as a larger sort of team, the sort of team logic that ends up operating in that sense. The commodity is also partially framed from the political economy of sport, which is who is thought to bring in more money, who is bringing in more media money, who is bringing larger endorsements, and what is considered to be quote unquote at risk. That's why we also give Kaepernick the higher graphic. You say, I know what quarterbacks could make, right? I know what you are sacrificing, as opposed to, well, the scale is just not even equal in general. So the sacrifice is greater when you think about the ratio of how much you make. It's telling a millionaire you will make less, but you will still get Nike money. You will still get Disney money. You still will get media money. And telling Gwen Berry she may not get this Puma deal is very different. And I think that's why it's been interesting to watch women's sports navigate this social moment, as well as navigate these moments of refusal to play and to participate, in part because I think, and she wasn't in the slide because complicated reasons, Serena Williams, watching what Serena Williams has gone through has been an interesting way for particularly Black women athletes to say, I will not be subjected to that, and the current turn towards understanding larger scales of mental health in sports. So Simone Biles self-selecting to sideline herself, despite her fact that the reason why I kept saying, I think it's about these women feel that they are like God is in them, like they are doing something so good. She says it's her God-given talent. And so finding this resource and then saying, if that's the case, then I can elect not to participate in ways that at that scale, this is the only place in which she will be seen. She got the biopic treatment. She's not going to get the Colin Kaepernick. I have a lot of strong feelings about this Colin in black and white situation because Simone Biles got the Lifetime treatment. She and Gabby Douglas first got 2 major television movies. And so the ways in which her choice has larger ramifications for the longevity of her career, the way her performance happens and on a larger scale in visual culture, the losses are different and they're gendered. That sort of capitalist logic are gendered in very particular ways. And they play in the face of certain defeats already that are already racialized, gendered and sexualized for our Black queer players like Raven Saunders. So just some thoughts.
Yeah, and yet, what's remarkable about 2021, I mentioned this a minute ago, and I'll say it again, and you mentioned it also, are the ways in which, Simone Biles and Osaka and others disrupting, certain core principles, like daring not to compete at the French Open in the ways that Osaka did, daring not to compete at the Olympics the way Simone Biles did, right? I mean, these are violations of everything that the high performing skilled athlete is supposed to do, is to compete regardless of the condition, the physical or mental condition of their physical mental condition. And so that leads me to this question. I mean, it's lingering in the thinking around the panel around ritual, right? And the ways in which whether, again, from Randall's presentation around the kind of rituals that team sports have had in the United States, particularly for white men, and the ways in which, Black athletes, male, female, and otherwise defined, have been coerced or lured into these rituals throughout the course of, the history of this country anyway, and other places as well, right? And how the politics of radical refusal are disrupting rituals. And I wonder if they're creating new ones. I want to hold out the possibility for other kinds of rituals that are gestured at or actually instantiated by Black performing athletes. I struggle to say bodies because I'm trying to hold on to the human maybe too much. But in other words, what I wonder about, I wonder if you could comment on, is this question of ritual, right? And Randall, you're a religious scholar, so I mean, this, from your own background as well. And Ben was referring to this as well in his comments about the ways in which ritual, the centrality of ritual in sport, which is an obvious point, but the ways in which they either reify racial hierarchies, gender, sexual hierarchies, and the ways in which the Black performing athletes now are disrupting them, and I would like to think perhaps creating new ones.
Well, I think there's some reason to think that. I keep coming back to the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. I mean, that gesture has been reappropriated by other athletes, most recently at the Olympics in Japan, as Samantha was pointing out. So there is some of that, and the kneeling is now permeating baseball and some other places as well. So yeah, there is some reappropriation of that, and that's obviously, I think that's very healthy. I think that's a good thing. To do that sort of thing, and getting back to the ritual of the national anthem, I kind of alluded to it quickly in my prepared remarks. I mean, you think about it, it's kind of silly when we don't do this at a rock concert. We don't have everybody stand up and listen and sing or try to sing the national anthem. There's something peculiar about sports where you try to, or at least in the past, you've tried to cloak the contest in nationalism and patriotism, and it's rather silly. I mean, the Dallas Mavericks tried to do away with it for a while, but they simply couldn't pull it off.
Other thoughts on ritual or the constitution of new ones, or are we just talking about radical refusal, which is good enough for me, but I'm just curious about the generative power of radical refusal.
I'm happy to chat now. Okay.
Yeah.
I like the phrase that Professor Sheppard used, that the moments of refusal. Something that I and others have been kind of thinking through in relation into sports, because one of the, you could argue one of the interesting facets about sports is the ever present phenomenon of failure. Like, sports are, if anything, they're about failure. They're not about winning. The Boston Marathon will have one winner and thousands of losers. This year in the NFL, one team will win the Super Bowl. The rest are losers. They failed. And so there's something that's fascinating about sports as a space that's so fixated on winning and winners and champions, which produces constant failure. Like, nothing produces more losers more constantly readily than sports. So it's a factory for losers. And there was many years ago, there was a great photographic work by an Australian artist photographer. I forget her name. I think it was Moffat, Helen Moffat. So she was tracing. Yes, thank you. And commissioned by the IOC to do the photographs for would have been the Sydney Olympics, which would have been 86. God, I'm exposing myself now. I should know this off the top of my head. The Sydney Olympics. Not 80, 96 would sounds better. Whatever. You can correct me.
2000.
2000. There you go. Yeah, that was a controversial one, wasn't it? Because Greece wanted it to tie in with the anyway. And she decided to photograph everybody that came in fourth. Which of course, so you photographed the winners, yes. And there was something interesting about her project, which was this idea of like finishing fourth is the worst. You know, like you obviously want to win. You get the gold medal, you're the champ. At least with second or third, you're the Olympic medalist. Yeah, I mean, it's disappointing, but fourth, like you were so close for the rest of your life. Everyone's gonna say, "Oh, fourth." Oh. They're not going to say congratulations on getting to the final of the Olympics. They're only going to think, "Oh man, fourth. That's got to hurt." And she takes these photographs of the moment where the person realizes they've just come outside of the medals. And of course, the photographs are deeply human. Yeah, that then she captures something very fundamental about the human condition. And so I've actually become interested in how failure, which is a constitutive part of sports, is dealt with, the thing that can't be acknowledged. There's that great moment when Roberto Duran refuses to come out of the fight and says, "No mass, no mass, no mass, no more, no more, no more." And it's read into, no, so this is the kind of argument. This is either a failure, yes, a failure of masculinity, a sporting failure, or it's a deeply human moment in which we recognize that actually that to move forward under these conditions will produce pain and suffering, and actually that the correct decision is to engage in a moment of refusal, like a radical refusal, and to actually embrace failure as part of the human condition rather than seeing it as a deviation. And so and this is similar to what Jack Halberstam and others talked about in relation to queer, the idea that to be queer, you failed as a heterosexual, and the kind of reclaiming of this. And I think what's been interesting is to see a number of largely women of color, Black women in particular, athletes, leading the discussions around reconstituting what would otherwise be called a mental health vulnerability or mental health failure, which up until now was only read as weakness, was only read as a lack of strength, was only understood as not being tough enough. And that's also why in this moment you saw the appalling attacks on Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles by conservatives like the British journalist Piers Morgan, the Candace Owens, the conservative commentator over here, Thomas Chatterton Williams, the non-Black conservative writer who hangs out in Paris, who all kind of came out and said that this was bad for sports and bad for, and sometimes even pushed it bad for civilization, because civilization is about the noble sacrifice. Yes, this kind of hyper masculine idea that sports outside of war and the military, the closest thing we have are sports and the gladiators, who are supposed to, quote, put their bodies on the line and go the extra yard. There's a great interview one of my friends, Cole Sprackland, did many years ago for a professional rugby league player, who asked him about this commitment to kind of hegemonic masculinity and the idea of putting your body on the line. And this rugby league player said to him, "I wouldn't die for my team, but I would go into an extended coma for my team." In other words, clearly like dying is ridiculous. No one wants to die, but an extended coma, you come out in a few days, maybe a week or two, your brain recovers, but you've won. Yeah, I'll do that. In no other area of life would we suggest that going into an extended coma in order to get our publication article published or to get a good grade for an essay would be a logical thing to do. And yet that is one of the kind of sadomasochistic, self-harming, alienating, dehumanizing logics that sports produces. And what's fascinating is maybe we have a new ritual, to tie ritual into the other question, Frank, Professor Guridy, is that we have a new ritual, which isn't actually lionizing and elevating the athlete who breaks their body for the team, but who says, you know what, as Simone Biles said, I think I've got the wobbles, which, like I'm not fully right in my mind, and I'm about to do I'm about to do a physical movement in which if I'm not 100% on it, like I could die. I mean, and that's the other thing about elite sports. So most elite sports, which I think many fans don't get, is that the levels of human performance now have been so stretched to the boundaries of what's physically possible, whether or not that's cricket, soccer, football, gymnastics, and, and obviously things like motor racing, that, a slight mistake can have catastrophic consequences for the human body. Yeah. And elite athletes get this. And what's been fascinating, I think, in this moment are led by female athletes in particular, female athletes of color, and especially Black women, to say, no mass, no mass. We want to, can we at least have a discussion around the conditions under which we perform and play so that we can maybe do this in a more humane way that gives us a 5, 10, 15-year career. And at the end of our career, our bodies are still intact. And then just think of the narcissistic, arrogant pushback by some of these commentators to say, how dare you? How dare you put your body before my fan spectatorship interests in seeing you? Push your body to the absolute limits. You'll snap a bone or two, a ligament or two, potential head damage, concussions for life. But I've got my enjoyment to get out of paying my pay-per-view. I think this is a really important moment.
I just want to add a quick addition to that idea of ritual, because with sports being such, I mean, a field of play, but also like a field of play, like an allegorical terrain, it makes sense that, the idea of going the distance is what's supposed to really matter. And as you point out, failure being so imbricated in the concept of athleticism. And of course, what is, the most popular sports film, 76, Rocky, it's about going the distance. Like, you got to lose so you can come back with at least 5 more sequels and a spinoff, right? We've got to have this. But I think the ways in which that ritualized white violence is what I actually really want to point out, because I think between that and the rise of MMA and like the white fighter in the UFC is an interesting conversation around how we think about who is willing to put their bodies on the line. And it's not just white fighters, but I'm just making that side point. And now, as you pointed out, about Black women athletes circumventing the system that already was never going to work for them, as opposed to being deluded by the idea that if I just follow along and go along, this is going to produce something besides a spinoff on Dancing with the Stars. And that's the trajectory, that's the turn we're going in. And so I think that there's something really, really, really interesting to think about refusal. And like I said, with the WNBA and now what we see happening with the Women's Soccer League is this idea of reimagining what collective bargaining and collective will do, especially through the language of this is supposed to be a sacred, safe space for us. And I think that, so reinterpreting what that language as a social justice, sort of a secular social justice kind of framing, has been interesting to see happen in women's sports, in the ways that, the men took a pause. I think I've said this on a podcast somewhere, after Jacob Blake was killed, got a call from Obama, I say social justice movement cannot obviously you cannot have a nap. Because by the next day we playing, right? It's just like, it was like, oh, I'm so sorry. That was just a dream. And so I just think that there's something very interesting of the ways in which women's sports, which has been on the side, has created different kinds of narrative trajectories and historical lines of refusal as well as participation.
That's exactly right. And I love Ben's idea of reclaiming failure and reconfiguring Roberto Duran's decision to stop fighting in the middle of the 8th round of his fight against Sugar Ray Leonard in the Superdome in 1980. No mas, right? No mas has a completely different meaning. He was humiliated, of course, and that was not seen as a project of radical refusal. But now here we are, again, women athletes of color, Black women athletes, literally. And I see the Williams sisters as even this transitional figure too, because they, even throughout their career, they were successful, obviously, but they were able to redefine their relationship to the tennis industrial complex, right? By competing selectively, by not competing in Indian Wells for a long time, for example, because of the racism they experienced there, right? And that's part of the reason why they've lasted so long, even though, they've experienced their own injuries and traumas, et cetera, right? So reclaiming, the kinds of things that you're both alluding to here, the three of you, are these new kinds of, rituals for that the athletes are generating, but I think that now that fans can embrace themselves. I want to get to a couple of the questions that are showing up here. There was one, this is from Matthew, a question for the three of you. So we've got about 7 minutes. So I'd like to ask somehow if you could keep the answers a little quicker. Could the three of you, or whoever decides, speak from your own disciplinary perspectives about the histories of the gesture, right? He's thinking about the 1968 Black Power salute by Smith and Carlos at the Olympics, which became iconic. But what else, with or without the intersection of race, can we point to in these histories of the gesture? How can we think about the semiotics, in a global frame beyond the US? And this dovetails with another point made by another audience member about some of the experiences of the anti-Muslim Islamophobic experiences of women athletes around the hijab, for example. And there's other questions here about uniforms. So if you could think about, just from your own perspective, about the history of the gesture, gesture beyond Smith and Carlos, that's sort of what we'd like you to talk about now, if you could briefly, somehow.
Well, Smith and Carlos, and I guess the next one that would kind of occur to me would be Mahmoud Abdul Rauf with the national anthem again, and of course Colin Kaepernick. Those would be the kind of the three top ones that I would think of, but I'll think about a little bit more while the others answer.
I want to get into the homoerotic, but that question hasn't come up, so let me just park that, and if we can get back to it, I want to see if we can think through some of those dimensions as well of the kind of the racialized homoerotic aspects, especially of men's competitive sports, and the white desire for Black athletic bodies, male bodies in particular. So that I think one of the difficulties is that even for those of us that have written about these topics for a while, I think I want to make a claim that we are in to invoke Wallerstein for a moment, that we are in a global world revolution. That there's a revolution taking place right now that's comparable to the claims that Wallerstein would make about the late 60s in sports, in the sporting context. And that because of that, it's very hard for us to make sense of what's going on. It's too soon to tell. That old line from Mao, whoever it was, about the French Revolution. What do you think of it? It's too early to tell. We need to come back at least 50 years from now. And I think, given the fresh faces on this Zoom, we can maybe pull this off 30 years from now to really work out what's happening in this moment. Because of the dangers, we kind of make stabs at analysis that we just know it's in flux, it's moving, and we're seeing fragments of the conjunctural shifts. And we're not sure what's significant and what's meaningful and what's epiphenomenal and what's just a fad. So full disclosure, like most of what I say, is who knows how much of it is true and accurate. But that said, I do think something is happening. So it's remarkable. If we do go back to that moment in August 2016, when Colin Kaepernick sat down, as we all know, and then later decided to take a knee. So that was interesting, that shift in the symbolism of his conversation, I think, with Nat Bauer, the former UT Austin player who played a little bit of time in the NFL, who said, no, this is a more respectful way to do the protests. This is what we do in the Marines, take a knee, and the whole story that comes out of that. And however much that story is actually true. Well, and then the attacks on Colin Kaepernick, that we know losing his job effectively, not being re-employed. And at least for at least 18 months, fairly ostracized, some kind of symbolic support. It wasn't really until Donald Trump does that talk where he calls the players sons of bitches that finally the NFL kind of changes position. And you see this kind of most ludicrous spectacle of someone like Jerry Jones locking arms with the players to show solidarity. So, but that period up until then, Kappa being left out to dry, more or less. Yeah, I mean, there was symbolic support to move from that moment to where, for those of you that watch the English Premier League, before every single game in England, and including the England men's national team and the women's team as well, the players will take a knee before the game starts. They take a knee for an action that cost Colin Kaepernick his job in the NFL. Players in a different country, in a different sport that is 25% black, most of the players are white. The managers take a knee, the coaches take a knee, the referees and the referees' assistants take a knee. Like, everyone takes a knee. Now let's become so normalized that we need to take a step back to think like, what the heck? How have we gone from Cap losing his job in the NFL because that was outside of the boundaries of permissible forms of black protest, to like referees in England also taking a knee alongside majority white players with the white coach and the white manager all taking a knee? I was saying to look, young people growing up now, I think that's how you start a game of professional soccer in England. Like, you take a knee, like that's like, it's one of the rules by FIFA. Like, I expect the next version of like the FIFA 2021 on the computer game, the players will automatically take a knee and then you start the game. So now the clause, and this is where the danger of symbolism comes into, yeah? Does the ubiquity and the universality of it somehow take away from the meaning and the purchase that it has? Because it becomes ritualistic in a sense that we do it without the understanding and meaning and the context, yes? Just as we do in so much of our lives, you know, I don't want to be telling professors of religion and anthropologists about rituals. I mean, this is the area in which they understand the best. So that's the danger. But then this is why I frame my talk as it was. I do think something has shifted in a positive way, because it punctures into that space something that is always trying to be kept out. This idea that sport is apolitical, that these things don't matter. And at the very least, even as happened recently, some players are now refusing to take a knee. They now have to explain why they're refusing to take a knee, the justification for it. And their sentence has to start with, of course, I'm against racism and I'm committed to fighting against racism. And these are the reasons why I think taking a knee has become ritualistic in the negative sense. And this is what I'm going to do instead. So a Chelsea player doesn't take a knee now, one of the white players, I think it's Alonso. Instead, he points to the badge, which is on all of the Premier League jerseys that says end racism, no to racism. So he points at his badge. This is circulated. This is now a global issue. Yes, it's gone way beyond one player in the NFL. And that's partly because racism is a global issue. It's partly because white supremacy was a part of a global formation that comes out of coloniality. And we're still living with the kind of revulsions and pushbacks of that. And it's fascinating that sports has become the locus for these discussions. You could argue that the most important public form of anti-racism today is taking place on the sports field.
And I would chime in on that point and say that, you know, my real field, I'm an interloper on the sports thing, so I apologize for that. But my real field is American religious history. And you look at American religious history, and in the past, we look to religious figures as moral voices, people like Walter Rauschenbusch, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. Now we look to the world of sports for moral guidance. People like Colin Kaepernick, people like LeBron James, who are vocal proponents of the Black Lives Matter movement. So religion has really receded, I think, in that sense, in terms of having a moral voice within the society. And in many respects, athletes have supplanted them.
Yes, and sometimes that's not for the best, as we've seen recently around the vaccination polarization here.
Right.
So we're already over 7, but I want to give Professor Sheppard an opportunity to contribute to this last point, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes. No, I mean, I think that all the comments are spot on. I think what lingers in the cultural imaginary, that's why Tommy Smith and John Carlos sign becomes remembered. Colin Kaepernick has become a global image and an icon, and the act, as you said, has been contextualized and recontextualized in a new space, and therefore becomes disarticulated and rearticulated in new racial formations. The only other thing I would probably add is that the way we remember this will also take part in other production cultures and cultures of production. That's why I'm very interested to see how we remember this visually. Not just in terms of the covers, the Time magazine with Kaepernick, and it says, the perilous fight, and this, new ebony cover. But the Netflix series is different than what Tommy Smith and John Carlos got, which has just been like a couple of docs, and a scene in Remember the Titans where they're fighting over a poster, which is all about racial harmony anyways. So it will be interesting to see how we culturally want to remember this mode of resistance, and then therefore, as I want to keep pointing out, continue to just abscond the ways in which, I'm sorry, there are women's names, and I'm very fortunate to have a colleague and friend named Amira Rose Davis, who is working particularly on women in sports and history. She brings up Rose Robinson, who these people who did not go to the Pan American Games in 1959 in Chicago. Like, women's refusal looks like actual refusal. Not that I showed up at my job and then I put a knee down. Like, I stopped working there. Like, and then also worked in other places and did activism in other ways, as well as in 1970s, there was just a range of Black cheerleaders who found themselves also attached to the idea of the Black athlete in revolt, despite the way that OPHR and Harry Edwards decidedly really excluded women from that conversation. And so I just want to always center the fact that women we just have been doing this stuff and have been modeling the acts of refusal. And I think we want to again ask ourselves the ways in which Kaepernick's action meets with one of the biggest, most American games, besides basketball being football, meets with somebody who in the Obama era is this biracial figure who is supposed to be this transcending of race, who then embraces pick a side narrative, and therefore his actions become abstracted to mean again throughout place and time. So yay.
Absolutely. And I want to thank the three of you, and Ben, you're exactly right. We're in the middle of this now. And so, you're offering extremely, important insights here in a moment where things are in flux. And as you said, Ben, that something's happening here. It's not clear where we're going, but there's definitely movement, and that's been very clear. I think it was evident in your three presentations today and our discussion afterwards. So I want to thank the audience for zooming in and joining us for this virtual discussion, which really could just go on for hours more. We just got started here today, but I think you've given us a lot to think about as we continue to think about these issues and work on them. I want to thank again Matthew and Mariana for putting this session together, and I look forward to having more enriching conversations around protest and piety in sports world and beyond as we continue to move this historical moment of crisis and uncertainty. Thank you all for zooming in.